few hardware failures feel quite as unfair as the fate the Sega Dreamcast frankly never deserved. What many hoped would be a grand return to form for Sega turned out to be the final nail in the coffin. It's a sad story, once again filled with odd choices on the Japanese giant's part, but this time their undoing mostly came down to the fact that there was just no room left for anyone but Xbox, Sony and Nintendo, with even PC gaming going huge thanks to games like Half-Life. But is that what really happened to the Sega Dreamcast? Despite over 500 games being produced for the system between 1998 and 2001, and a decidedly splashy PR blitz that wasn't totally successful, but sure was fun to watch. Let's find out as we explore the sad downfall of the Sega Dreamcast. Hey, why don't you explore the comments section and you could win a free Steam key? Simply comment 29k gang down below and we will draw a winner next Friday. Sega lost a significant chunk of time mucking around with the 32X and Sega CD in the 90s, coupled with the disastrous Sega Saturn run, and in that period Sony became the console king. Microsoft was coming down the track with Bill Gates and the Rock's giant baby boy, and despite a rocky road for the Nintendo 64, Nintendo was still very much in the fight. Where does that leave a company that hadn't released a successful console in almost 7 years? Sega saw the writing on the wall by the year 2000, with good but not breathtaking sales for the Dreamcast topping out at a little over 9 million. As we look at how the Sega Dreamcast failed, we'll see a story that in many ways was very familiar to a company that gave Nintendo a serious challenge in the early 90s. At the same time, the story of the Sega Dreamcast is a unique chapter in the extraordinary history of Sega, and not just because of Blue Stinger. Blue Stinger Hive, arise. They soon made the choice to abandon the system even earlier into its lifespan than they had with the Saturn just a couple of years prior. Some reports suggest the Dreamcast was doomed shortly after it was announced, with Sega never quite recovering from the waking nightmare that was the release of the Saturn and wanting to get out of the hardware business for good.
We're losing altitude. Time to dump all unnecessary weight.
That would track with a company that began planning the Dreamcast very early into the life of their heavily hyped Sega Saturn. The new system would come to be known by a variety of project names, including White Belt, Black Belt, Guppy and Dural, depending upon which hardware team we're talking about. But there's a lot more to consider with this story beyond Sega's then shocking plans to start anew after so much had been spent on the Saturn. You can begin with Sega of America president and CEO Tom Kalinske leaving early into the Saturn's release, replaced by recent Sony hire Bernard Stolar. It would be Stolar's decision to give up on the Saturn and seek redemption with the Dreamcast, later saying, "I thought the Saturn was a mistake as far as hardware was concerned. The games were obviously terrific, but the hardware just wasn't there." Let's go back just 12 months or so from the release of the Sega Dreamcast in Japan on November 27th, 1998, in the US and Canada on September 9th, 1999, 999, get it, and in Europe on the less cool sounding 14th of October of that year. Wait, isn't that Usher's birthday? Thanks, Little John. Thanks. The year is 1997 and the Sega Saturn is getting pummeled by corporate arrogance, the rising tide of enthusiasm for Sony's PlayStation, and Nintendo providing considerably more stability than their heated rival of nearly a whole decade. Former Sega of America CEO and President Tom Kalinske is long gone. In his place, it's Bernard Stolar indicating in a 1997 interview that the Saturn is not our future. The quote has been famously, and perhaps mistakenly, attributed to remarks Stolar made at E3 1997. It's not like the internet to get things wrong. Regardless of that, and despite plans to continue supporting the Saturn for at least a little while longer, this was a bold statement just 2 years into the release of Sega's solid but beleaguered console. The company was bleeding cash, he would later say, and I wanted to build a new team. The decision on Stolar's part was controversial then and is still remembered with some scorn by Saturn's fans. Stolar had already frustrated them with his dismissal of localizing certain games for the Western market, further infuriating them with his inability to see the growing potential of RPGs with players in North America and Europe. His decision to ultimately kill the Saturn after 2 financially miserable years for the system was not a popular one, to put it mildly. A trickle of releases would continue through 1997 and even into 1998, but the writing was on the wall. Sega was ready to start a new chapter. Surely they had learned all their lessons and it would be smooth sailing from here on out.
Dumb bitch.
Yeah, maybe not. It's interesting to remember now that the enduringly popular Shenmue series initially began as a major effort to drag the Sega Saturn out of the doldrums. Maybe all those forklifts might have helped, you never know. The decision to move on from the Saturn far sooner than perhaps anyone had originally planned shifted the game to becoming a hopeful killer app for a system that was announced shortly after Sega's grim reporting of losses in excess of 35.6 billion yen, or a not very nice 269.8 million US dollars. Before the last Saturn games were even out the door, rumours spread by Sega themselves indicated that the new console was being fast-tracked. The Dreamcast did even manage to beat the PS2, Xbox and GameCube to market.
Stop! 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 Please let me go! Please let me go first! I'm doing something!
And this time, things were going to be different. And to some extent, things were different. It would be simply wrong to say Sega didn't learn a single thing from the Saturn's failure. The company made some smart moves early on, bolstered by an enthusiastic approach by Stolar and other top executives at Sega. 2 development teams had worked on potential hardware for the Dreamcast itself, one from America and one in Japan led by Hideki Sato. While both teams developed similar hardware, a serious misfire on the part of 3DFX, the company chosen by the American team, would lead to lawsuits and bad blood. 3DFX, or FUDFUX as it's written, had revealed too much information on their recent work with Sega, leading to the Japanese team's concept for the Dreamcast being chosen as the one that would go forward. Stolar would later deny Sega chose one over the other due to poor judgment by 3DFX. It was really just the technology end of it, he claimed. With the system in full production mode, things seemed promising, and the gamble to begin fresh had at least a shot at working out, despite the time Sega spent on this new system being dominated by Sony and Nintendo, leaving a thriving healthy Sega further and further in the past. Yuji Naka, who's definitely a bit of a silly goose, and not just because he made Balan Wonderworld, and his legendary Sonic team were working on a powerhouse 3D Sonic title. Shenmue was shaping up to be something pretty dang special. Capcom, Midway and even Namco, fresh off the success of games that helped put the PlayStation over the top, were preparing arcade-style heavyweights to debut on the Dreamcast. Sega would even hedge their bets with a full line of incredible sports games that could only be played on the Dreamcast. They even went so far as to purchase Visual Concepts, a San Rafael, California company that would make sports titles such as NFL 2000 and NBA 2000 available when the system launched in the United States. It's crazy that it took them 1,999 prequels before these ones to make an actual good game, but Rome wasn't built in a day, I guess. This seemingly smart decision, however, would later come back to haunt Sega, who are more haunted by past mistakes than Ebenezer Scrooge after he invested in NFTs. We'll get into that soon enough. On the precipice of its launch, the Dreamcast looked strong. It would use the Hitachi SH4 architecture, with an eye towards making programming games for the system considerably simpler than it had been with the Saturn. Again, Sega wanted to do things right this time, and this focus ensured the distinct possibility of a far more successful launch. The Dreamcast would feature a 100MHz clocked, 7 million textured and lit polygons, 100 MP, 8 MB of memory, full screen anti-aliasing, volumetric effects, alpha blending and more. And we're not just talking about Sega Sports flag to flag. In short, it was a system that could handle what Sega had in mind for not only themselves, but the various third-party developers that were ready to make games. Sega was even reimagining the relationship the console would have to Sega's arcade business with the release of Naomi in 1998. A mass-produced, cost-effective machine that would utilise large ROM cartridges for its games, Sega was confident in not only developing a new generation of extraordinary arcade titles, but that these games could then be ported to the Dreamcast with ease. Sega and Bernard Stolar were also banking on people getting excited about the Dreamcast having a modem, making it the first console with such a feature as well. Sega was right to see a lot of potential in the future of online gaming. And yes, look how far we've come. Look how far we've come. Anyway, back in 1998, the stage was set. The Dreamcast would launch in Japan on November 27th, 1998, with release the following year in the US and Europe. Sega had every right to look confident for the first time in what at least felt like a long time. Fans were excited as well. What could everyone expect though? A mixed bag would be putting it mildly, but initially the forecast was far less gloomy than it had been for the Saturn. The Dreamcast started strong in Japan. Pre-orders came in at a steady pace at the outset, only to be met with disaster when Sega found themselves contending with a massive shortage of the Power VR chipset that would be used to power their system. By Sega's own admission, they believe they could have sold 200,000 to 300,000 more units if the supply had not been shortchanged by a startlingly high failure rate of the chipsets during the manufacturing process. Sega would sell out on launch day in Japan, but the company failed to meet its shipping objective, though mercifully this had nothing to do with the shipping harbour objectives in Shenmue. Further dampening the launch was the reality that only one of the 4 launch games, Virtua Fighter 3, sold particularly well. Both Sonic Adventure and Sega Rally Championship would be on the way in short order, but not on release day as had been previously promised. To some it felt a little like more of the same with Sega. There were even reports of disappointed consumers returning their Dreamcast to get PlayStation stuff. Sega had hoped to establish a dominant lead before Sony and Nintendo came out with their new consoles, but this was becoming increasingly less likely. The Japanese launch could best be described as tepid, but probably better than the Saturn. By the time the North American launch was being prepared, Sega was selling the Dreamcast at almost a complete loss, announcing a new online network for their modem and replacing Bernard Stolar in the United States with a fresh face named Peter Moore, the world's least annoying Liverpool fan, but still a pretty annoying Liverpool fan. At this point, it was becoming increasingly obvious that Sega would need to win and win big with the American market, as well as other markets like Europe if they had any hope of surviving the dawn of the new millennium. For many, the Dreamcast US marketing blitz throughout 1999 is fondly remembered today for being interesting and ambitious, with the tagline, "It's thinking." This reference to the untapped power of the Dreamcast suggested something unique and mysterious. Perhaps too mysterious, as some have since argued that the campaign was far too vague, with claims that the campaign was mocked from the start. I mean, I'm pretty sure one of the PlayStation 2's many weird-ass ad campaigns was Michael Barrymore getting hosed down by a digital cat made entirely from the lint you get between your toes after you wear your socks for too long, so I don't really know about that one. Did any PS2 adverts give you night terrors? Let us know down below. Regardless of whether or not any of that's true, Sega did get people's attention, sporting its unique controller, a visual memory unit VMU memory card with its own screen, and more than 17 launch games, far more than the Japanese launch. The Sega Dreamcast opened big on September 9th, 1999. With more than $97 million in sales, it was the most successful console launch in history up to that point. Sega for the moment appeared to be back, with several games receiving hefty praise and strong sales, including Sonic Adventure, Soul Calibur and NFL 2K. Unfortunately, the only company that suffered during the Dreamcast launch was Nintendo, with reports that far more N64 owners were trading in their systems for a Dreamcast than PlayStation owners were. I mean, to be fair, they still had C12 The Final Resistance to look forward to, can you blame them? Sony was at the top of the heap at this point, and Sega couldn't put much of a dent in their fortunes. Sega's online service was announced the day Sony put out the word on the US release of the PlayStation 2, but Sega Net suffered due to the inability of broadband internet to expand into more homes as Sega had hoped it would. By the end of 1997, Sony had sold over 20 million consoles. Nintendo was barely keeping up, and they were far more consistent with their console success and game releases than Sega had been in a long time. The PlayStation 2 just simply couldn't be stopped, and not just because the bouncer sold 800 million copies. Even Nintendo would find that out the hard way. Dreamcast was a phenomenal 18 months of pain, heartache, euphoria, Peter Moore would later say, after inheriting the thankless job of running Sega's American branch from Bernard Stolar. We thought we had it, but then PlayStation came out, that infamous issue of Newsweek with the Emotion Engine on the cover, and of course, EA didn't publish, which left a big hole, not only in sports but in other genres too. What Moore is referring to, of course, was the infamous falling out between EA and Sega, once best buds in the early days of the Genesis. EA didn't want to share sports game space with Visual Concepts, the company Sega had purchased to make exclusive sports titles who are now under the 2K Sports umbrella. While Sega would put out some brilliant sports titles during the Dreamcast's life, franchises like Madden just had too much inherent name value to be defeated. And that is perhaps the most consistent thread in the regrettable history of the Dreamcast. Anything the system could do, someone else, usually Sony, could do better. Sega had a wide window in which to establish a lead over the PS2, but the PS2 eventually launched in most major markets in the early months of the year 2000, and Sega's lead, defined by sales goals Sega failed to meet with the Dreamcast and its hardware, disappeared completely. The PlayStation 2 had more anticipated games, backwards compatibility with a massive PS1 library, and perhaps most importantly in the year 2000, a functional DVD player. Sega, meanwhile, could do little more than bleed money. Slashing console prices helped them stay in the game, but at what cost? We were selling 50,000 units a day, then 60,000, then 100,000, Peter Moore said, but it was just not going to be enough to get the critical mass to take on the launch of PS2. Quite a lot of cost then. Sega losing most of the people who truly believed in the Dreamcast didn't help matters either. In particular, one of the Dreamcast's biggest proponents, Hayao Nakayama, left his position as CEO of Sega. Longtime Sega executive Shoichiro Irimajiri was gone by this point as well. Internal restructuring by people who wanted to simplify things at Sega soon became a growing call to leave the hardware business behind. Eventually, despite taking a moment to throw some shade at Sony over their PS2 shipment difficulties, which is like Madame Web fans having a dig at Spider-Man 3 for not being very good, the call was answered. On January 31st, 2001, Sega announced that they were abandoning the Dreamcast worldwide and leaving the hardware business for good.
Bye, Mo!
They would remain open to begin developing third-party software for other consoles, and this has been the company's highly successful focus ever since. Well, some of the time. Alright, on occasion. Okay, well, at least we have another Crazy Taxi to look forward to, and it will definitely be good. Oh, please be good. It's easy to call the Dreamcast another Sega failure, but clearly this was a wonderful, sometimes bizarre console that had virtually no chance of recouping its costs, let alone dominating a market that was now virtually unrecognisable to Sega from when they had broken into the field years earlier. From its controller and VMU memory card to groundbreaking titles like Jet Set Radio, Crazy Taxi and Shenmue, and also the utterly f***ing bonkers and incredible Seaman, the Dreamcast is one of the better pieces of pop culture from its time and place. Sega is still around, and that does count for something with a company that's home to so many iconic characters and legendary games. The list of good Dreamcast games is far longer than many give it credit for. Perhaps there's a hint of nostalgia behind remembering the year 1999 and the promise of what the future might hold, represented to some degree by concepts like the Dreamcast, and where we as a culture went from there. Yeah, perhaps. But when you cut through the static of Sega's poor business decisions, bad luck, stiff competition, and our own memories of younger, perhaps better days, what you're left with when it concerns the Dreamcast is a fascinating system with dozens of games you could pick up today and still enjoy. True classics never truly age where it counts, and the Dreamcast had a bunch of them. In the end, Peter Moore once said, "It didn't work out. It was tough, but those were great days, and I've never met anybody who regretted buying a Dreamcast." Soul Calibur, anyone? And that was our video looking back on the wonderful, weird system that was the Dreamcast. What's your favourite Dreamcast memory? Be sure to let us know down below in the comments, down below. And thank you for watching.